So if you're anything like me, you may feel in two minds about what your role is in anti-racism. Sometimes I feel like the best thing that I need to do is to not talk, to not say anything, to not engage because I don't understand, to be quiet, that I don't have a role to play in anti-racism. I don't have a role to play in like building equality. Is that really true? Well, in this video, I'm gonna kind of discuss what I think are 5 things that we can do to work towards a more equitable role, and what, in my opinion, like based on the reflections that I've had and the readings that I've done and the education that I've had both in the real world and in academia, what is the role of white people in anti-racism? So, the first thing that we're going to address is, do white people even have a role to play in anti-racism? And this is something that I have reflected on quite a bit, because I feel like white people can talk too much. White people have too much of a platform. White people have too many people listening to them. And when we see examples of people who are white compared to people who are black, we can see the different ways in which society interacts with them. So this leads me to point number 1. One of the most important things that we can do as white people is actively promote and consume the voices, the opinions, the lived experiences, but the academic knowledge, the intellectual understanding, the creative, like everything of people of color, in order to understand. Because I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Like, that's the first point, is that we have to build understanding. We have to build our awareness, and to do that, we have to purposely drive ourselves towards actively consuming literature, consuming videos, consuming academia that comes from not only people of color, but people from color who are affected by whatever it is that we are reading about or whatever it is that we are researching. So that was number 1. Actively consuming and listening to the voices of other people. Promoting the voices of people of color is massively important as well. But that doesn't mean that white people don't have a role to play, because actually, when we look at it, when we understand what racism is a problem of white people, not a problem of people of color. And this is an inverse, right? Because this was this whole like, how does it feel to be a problem phenomenon, in which the problem of racism was projected from the white person onto the person of color. But it was just a way to displace guilt, which was a way to, in my opinion, justify colonial expansion and exploitation, and to justify the fact that, racism is ultimately profitable to white people, and that's why it continues to this day. And so I think that it's really important to understand that racism is actually a problem of white people. And so we do have a role in challenging these structures that exist both within ourselves and externally. So I do think that white people have a role to play, and white people are going to be like, oh, thank God for that. I really want a role to play. Like, just like me, I want a role to play. I want to have something that I can do to challenge these systems, even though I profit from them. I recognize, just on the basis of our humanity and on the basis of empathy, how incredibly wrong this is, and how incredibly I feel, how incredibly guilty I feel about that, based upon my colonial heritage as a British white woman. So I think that it's good news if you're watching this video and you're white. Like, we do have a role to play in anti-racism. But we also have to learn when to be quiet and when to not speak, and how to actively promote the voices of people of color in order to actually bring about the change that we want. Because I think that sometimes, and this is something that I have to be aware of myself, is that white people can try to propagate and try to appropriate, the platform, the anti-racist platform, in order to find a way to speak about racism. But it's such a delicate balance, because at the same time, when we speak about anti-racism, we have to be really careful not to disenfranchise most of the population, because that is actually truthfully what such a dialogue does. Like, how do white people come to terms with their role as the abuser? Like, it's really heavy. It's really, really difficult. And so, for example, the example of Britain has a really, really long journey to go on to come to terms with what our role was, and what we want our role to be in the future, which is made even more complicated by the fact that children of empire are now the country, So it's a big debate. But this brings me on to point number 2, which is definitely about the educational system, because the way in which empire and colonialism and history in general is taught, I'm taking a very British perspective here, is very much from that, the spoils of war goes to those who win, and we can write history as we want. I think that is massively, massively problematic, because we have to find a way to be able to critically engage with the past while also not spoon-feeding people guilt, because that was something that I read the other day from a lady in Germany. And in Germany, obviously, everybody is taught about the Nazis and what happened during the First World War and the Second World War to try to ensure that it will never happen again. But when we look at how the right wing is rising in Germany and in other European countries, it promotes a question of does that work? I don't have the answers. I just know that what is currently existing in British curriculum is problematic and it needs to be rewritten. Number three is not only pragmatic, but it's also symbolic in many ways. So obviously one of the big things that happened during colonialism was that historical cultural artifacts were stolen and were taken from the country back to, for example, Britain or France or whichever empire it was in question. And still, these countries refuse to, these museums and art galleries refuse to return such artifacts, which is mental. You stole something and then you continue to justify it by saying, no, it was a gift. Baby, it wasn't a gift. Calm down. I think that giving back artifacts is a really significant thing that has to be done and a process that has to be gone through. Point number 4 is really important, and it's about ensuring representation, because I think that this also links to the rewriting the curriculum, because we want our children to be brought up in the world that we want them to live in. So I think that ensuring representation is massively important for our children and among our children up until, adults. Because if you look at picture books, it's literally mostly white boys who live in the countryside and have a house. And it doesn't speak to a huge majority of the world. Who lives like that? Or what I really don't like as well is that when it's a children's book that's written by a person of color, and it has to be about the fact that they're of color. It has to be about the black skin. It has to be about the hair. It has to be about the hijab. And it's babe, why can't I just have a protagonist that does normal things that normal children do, but that child is coming from a Muslim family, that child is black? Why can't we normalize children's experiences rather than reducing individuals? This is one of the problems, is that people of color get reduced to these caricatures. It's the only thing of value that you have is this one part of you, and you are not attributed the same kinds of nuance that your white counterparts are right from the age of children, right? So in terms of books, in terms of film, in terms of TV, in terms of advertisements, everywhere, representation has to be ensured. And that doesn't only mean in terms of representing people symbolically, in terms of films and such forth. It also obviously means ensuring representation in organizations. We just need to ensure representation on a political level, on an economic level, and in our enterprises and in our institutions. So that's really about power reform, which goes from the micro to the macro perspective. So then the 5th thing that, in my opinion, we need to do is kind of the biggest, maybe, in my opinion. Not that the other ones weren't big, but I think that what's really significant is that we understand that racism is a system that exists because it is profitable. Racism was brought up into fruition because it justified colonial expansion, because it justified slavery, right? It created literally a race and a hierarchy of people. Why does it still exist today? Well, it still exists because it's still profitable to white people, and that's a fact. What's really important to understand is that neoliberalism, which is the current system of capitalism that we have, is racist. It is structurally racist, and that's how we're able to have the consumerist lifestyle that we have right now, because of racism and because of racialized difference, because different people in different parts of the world play different roles within these chains of production, in which people of color are at the bottom and they work, and that accumulation of labor comes to us. Of course, it's more complicated than that, because there are people who profit so much more than we do, who make up this 1%, this global ruling elite. And that is exactly the system that we need to challenge, that we need to end. We need to understand what neoliberalism is, how it operates, and we need to draw awareness and make the connection between neoliberalism and the current global form of capitalism and racism. If we want to live in an anti-racist world, if we want to live in a post-racist world, then it has to be post-neoliberal. It has to be post-capitalism. That's really important to understand, and that's not going to be something that happens overnight. It's not going to be something that happens in a generation. Like, I'm not going to see that in my lifetime, but that doesn't mean that we can't work towards that. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about that, because that's essentially important that we do talk about it and that more people become aware of what neoliberalism is. And that is what we need to dismantle in order to really tackle the structural problems that are posed by racism. So thank you very much for watching this video, and thank you for listening to my 5 suggestions of the kinds of things that I'm personally working towards in order to bring about the change that we need in this world. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you all have a really lovely day.